Amen. Well, welcome back. We are going to continue in this video our march through Matthew chapter 24, and we're going to be in verse 15. So if you want to turn there with me, we're going to be in Matthew 24, verse 15. He says, "Therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken by the prophet Daniel standing in the holy place, then let those who are in, whoever reads him, let him understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let him who is on the housetop not go down to take anything out of his house, and let him who is in the field not go back to get his clothes. But woe to those who are pregnant and to those who are nursing babies in those days. And pray that your flight may not be in winter or on the Sabbath. For then there will be great tribulation, such as not been since the beginning of the world until this time, nor ever shall be. And unless those days were shortened, no flesh would be saved. But for the elect's sake, those days will be shortened." So I guess foundationally, it's important to remember this is still all in Matthew 24, 1 through 34, where all of these passages are dealing with the disciples' three questions, and so we are still on that first question at this point. I think around verse 30, we transition to the second question, and we're on 15 through 22 right now. So he's still dealing with the signs of the destruction of Jerusalem, right? And so verse 15, he says, "When you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet," right? So first thing we ought to do to understand this is go back and read what Daniel had to say about it, because Jesus is using this phrase abomination of desolation, but he's getting it from Daniel, right? That's his point there. So let's go back to Daniel, and let's read from that. So we got Daniel. We're going to be in Daniel chapter 9, verse 26. So Daniel's giving this prophecy. Says, "After the 62 weeks, the Messiah shall be cut off, but not for himself." So clearly that part, we may do a whole section on Daniel's stuff here a little bit, but immediately when he says the Messiah is going to be cut off, that's talking about Jesus and the cross and his death, right? But not for himself. And so we know, when Daniel's writing this, he didn't fully understand. We know in hindsight, clearly what that's talking about is Jesus died on the cross and gave his life, but not for himself. It was for us. The Messiah came to die for us. "And the people of the prince who is to come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary." So talking about, so in Jesus' day, when Jesus is destroyed, he said there's a prince, a government, that's going to come, and they're going to destroy the city and the sanctuary. That's the temple. And so even in Daniel's writing, he makes it real clear that the death of the Messiah is going to be followed up fairly quickly by the kings of that generation that the Messiah dies in are going to come, and they're going to destroy the city and the temple, right? So in Daniel's day, when he's writing this, it's kind of mysterious. To us in hindsight, it should be 2020, right? That we know exactly what he's talking about. Jesus is going to come. He's going to die, but not for himself. It's for us. And following quickly on the heels of that, the prince, in other words, the leader of the kingdom that's in charge, which that is Rome, would be their Caesar, is going to come down, and he's going to destroy the city and the temple, right, which is Jerusalem and the temple. Everything happened exactly as he prophesied. "Then he shall confirm a covenant with many for 1 week, and in the middle of the week he shall bring an end to sacrifice and offering." So the the middle of the week bringing an end to sacrifice and offering? Well, where's the sacrifice? The temple, right? And where do you bring your offerings? They brought it to the temple. So that whole sacrificial system was when you're bringing your animals and your sacrifices, it carried two things with it. One, some of them were for sin offerings, for transgressions, so that it would act as forgiveness for what you have done, so that you had been right standing with God. And then the other thing was you're to take your first fruits and your tithes and your offerings, and these things are offered as free will gifts to the Lord. So when he says that he's going to put an end to that, it's clearly the destruction of the temple, right? That when the temple is destroyed, there's no place to bring those offerings anymore. There's no place to offer those sacrifices, right? And now here's what Jesus is talking about. And on the wing of abominations shall be one who makes desolate, even until the consummation which is determined is poured out on the desolate. So in this context, the one that's going to be desolate, means destroyed, is the city and the temple, right? That's the whole point of this whole passage, is he's saying, I see that after the Messiah is killed for others, that then the next thing is a government's going to come down and destroy the city and the temple, put an end to all of this sacrificial system, an end to all of the offerings we bring to the temple. And he calls it an abomination that causes desolation, or you could put in the word destruction. Clearly what he's talking about is that God's holy city and his temple being destroyed, that's an abomination. And it's destruction. And he said, and that will go on until the end is determined on the one who's desolate. So the one who's desolate is Jerusalem and the city. He says, so the prince who's going to come, that's going to destroy this, is going to be able to do whatever he wants until the fulfillment of the desolation has been fulfilled, until all the destruction that's been prophesied over Jerusalem and the temple is fulfilled. And so that's the core of what Jesus is talking about, right? And so it's real clear from Daniel that he's talking about the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple after the Messiah dies, right? And so Jesus, when he's answering the question of the disciples about when is the destruction of Jerusalem going to happen, it makes perfect sense then that he's going to quote this, because this is one of the most easy and clear passages of the Old Testament prophecies about the fall of Jerusalem after the Messiah. So not talking about the fall of Solomon's temple, but talking about the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple that's going to take place right after the death of the Messiah, right? And so here Jesus is with the disciples, and they're asking him about the fall of Jerusalem, and so he quotes from Daniel here, and it all fits together. It makes perfect sense. They're asking about the fall of Jerusalem. Daniel has a prophecy about the fall of Jerusalem, and so Jesus quotes it, and he calls it the abomination that makes of desolation. The abomination, and I'll let the cat out of the bag so that we can follow along. The abomination is the army of Rome that's going to stand around Jerusalem, and the abomination that makes desolate, it's the army, and they're going to make everything desolate. They're going to destroy this whole thing. So Jesus says, when you see, let's go back to Matthew now that we've read and clearly see what Jesus is talking about. When he's talking about the abomination, it's clearly something that has to do with the fall of Jerusalem. When I was in Bible school, they used to always teach that the Antichrist was going to come and set himself up in the temple and offer sacrifices in the temple, and that was the abomination. And then, so depending on your teacher, many of them talk, because there was a Greek leader, Hellenistic leader that had done some sacrifices of pigs. Antiochus Epiphanes, had done some of these sacrifices, and so everybody used to teach that he was the foreshadow of the Antichrist who was to come, who was going to offer these sacrifices in the temple. But that's missing the whole point of what he's saying. And I'm going to show you in Luke that Luke makes it real clear, because he retells the same quote from Jesus, but he makes it real clear that Jesus is not talking about offering sacrifices in the temple, and he's never even mentions the name of an antichrist or some great leader. He's clearly talking about the army of Rome is going to be standing around Jerusalem. But this kind of teaching that's real prevalent, you might have heard it, that, the abomination of desolation is this Antichrist is going to come and offer these sacrifices in the temple. Well, first of all this is still in Matthew 24, 1 through 34, where Jesus summarizes it and says, all this must happen in this generation. So what they do is they take that out of context and say, it hadn't happened yet. The Greek guy, he was just a forerunner. He was a type and shadow. The Antichrist is still to come, and all this is still to happen. So it kind of goes contrary to what Jesus said, that all this has to happen in that generation. But here's the other thing that kind of comes out of that. This is one of the main texts that people use to say that, there's got to be a third temple. How can the Antichrist come and offer abominations of desolation in the temple if there's not a temple? And so this is one of the main passages where people are saying, hey, there's got to be a third temple. Now, I don't know whether they're going to build a third temple or not. They can build whatever they want. But what I'm saying is this doesn't have anything to do with that. And God is not looking for a third temple. The church is the fulfillment of the temple. Just like Jesus was the fulfillment of the sacrifices, and we don't need any more of those. The temple was a picture and a type and shadow of God's presence abiding in his people. The threefold rooms of the temple are a picture of the threefold nature of humanity, that we have a body, a soul, and a spirit. And in that innermost place of the spirit is the throne room of God, where his presence dwells. And so the temple itself was always just a picture of us. And that has been fulfilled now, that God has put his spirit in his people. He is dwelling in that final temple right now because it's his people. So anyways, I think a lot of misunderstanding about the abomination of desolation is one of those key proof texts that people are pointing to. So, there's got to be a temple that happens before the Lord returns, because how can the Antichrist offer sacrifices in the temple if there is no temple? So first of all, Jesus never mentioned anything about an Antichrist in here. And so let's look, if you will, to, let me see here. Let me in Luke 21. Let's go over to Luke 21, because this is the same story here, except told through Luke. So Luke 21, and we're going to be in verse 20. And so it's the same thing. If you look in verse 7, it says, they asked him, teacher, when will these things be? What will the sign will there be when these things are about to take place? Verse 6, let me just start in verse 5. Matthew 21:5. Then as some spoke of the temple, how it was adorned with beautiful stones and donations, he said, these things which you see, the days will come in which not one stone will be left upon another that shall not be thrown down. Same thing as right before Matthew 24. So they asked him, saying, teacher, but when will these things be? And what sign will there be when these things are about to take place? So I just want to lay that foundation that Matthew 21 is the same story as Matthew 24. It's told through Luke's version of it. So we come down, Jesus is answering these questions, and he's still on the destruction of Jerusalem in verse 20. He says, but when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then you know that its desolation is near. So he used that same word desolation, but instead of abomination, he substitutes the word armies, which is essentially what that means in Matthew as well. The abomination that causes desolation is the army of Rome. And he makes that very clear in Luke 21:20. When you see Jerusalem, right, which that's what this whole thing's about, the fall of Jerusalem, right? Luke makes it real clear. When you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then you know that its desolation is near. So that was this weird teaching about the Antichrist being the abomination of desolation and all that kind of stuff. He's talking about, this is God's city. This is his temple. His spirit was supposed to be there, although it's not anymore. And he's saying there's an army there that's about to destroy it. That's an abomination. That God's house should be destroyed by pagans. It's an abomination. And and they are an abomination that's going to cause desolation. They're going to wipe out the entire thing. And now, right after Jesus in Matthew 24 talks about the abomination of desolation, as Daniel said, which Daniel's whole thing was about the fall of Jerusalem, he says, when you see that, flee and leave Jerusalem, leave Judea, get out of there. That's what he says in Matthew 24. Now watch, after he says in Luke 21:20, he says, when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, you know its desolation is near. And then he picks up with the same thing he says in Matthew 24 after the abomination of desolation, quote, he says, then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let those who are in the midst of her depart. Let not those who are in the country enter her. For these are the days of vengeance, that all things are written may be fulfilled. Woe to those who are pregnant and those who are nursing babies in those days, for there will be great distress in the land and wrath upon this people. Not 2,000 years from now, this people. And they will fall by the edge of the sword and be led away captive into all nations, and Jerusalem will be trampled by Gentiles until the time of the Gentiles are fulfilled. So, you can see that Luke 21:20 is talking about the same thing that Matthew 24:15 is talking about, that abomination of desolation. When you see it, don't go into the house, don't go back into your field, run, flee, because that means Jerusalem's about to be destroyed. And so you can put those two together, and it makes it real clear that Matthew, the abomination of desolation, when you see that, run, is the same thing he's saying in Luke 21, when you see the armies surrounding Jerusalem, run, right? To put those two together, it's very clear the abomination of desolation is the army surrounding Jerusalem that's going to desolate it, right? And then there's one other version of this that we could look at. It's Mark 13. All right, so all the synoptics have this same part. All right, so we're going back to Mark 13, and we're going to be in verse 14. He says, so when you see the abomination of desolation spoken by the prophet Daniel the prophet, standing where it ought not, let the reader understand. Let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let him who is on the housetop not go down to the house, nor enter to take anything out of his house. Let him who is in the field not go back to get his clothes. Woe to those who are pregnant and those who are nursing babies in those days. Pray your flight may not be in winter, for in those days there will be tribulation. Again, he's calling that the tribulation, such as not been seen since the beginning of creation, which God created until this time, nor shall there ever be. And unless the Lord had shortened those days, no flesh could be saved. But for the elect's sake, whom he chose, he shortened those days. Right? So, I do think it's important to understand, that going back to that tribulation thing just one more time, because that's such a big topic. You can see in Mark clearly, he's answering the question about the destruction of Jerusalem, and he says that there was, first of all, he says, don't stay in Judea, right? So this is not a worldwide prophecy. In each of these, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, when they're talking about it, Jesus tells them to flee Judea and the surrounding areas around Jerusalem. So he's clearly talking about the destruction of Jerusalem. It's not some, if this is some worldwide antichrist, it's missing the point, because he's clearly talking about Jerusalem, because the fleeing, the hiding, the destruction that's about to happen is taking place in Jerusalem. He says, everyone get out of there. And he says that what's about to happen there is the worst that has happened before or after. And so, there's so many people that preach a great tribulation to come that's worse than anything we've ever seen. But Jesus says the climax of tribulation is going to take place in this generation, and it's going to fall on Jerusalem. I think we got to wipe away that teaching that there's just some great thing, because Jesus said there's not going to be a greater tribulation coming after this. This is the climax of it. There won't be anything greater than this one. I think that's important to have in our mind there. And then let's go back to Matthew, right, to 24. So essentially what he's saying is now, if you're one of the people in Jerusalem, when Rome's army shows up and circles them, you're out of luck. Too late. right? All of those 3 or 4 million people were there for Passover, and when Rome surrounded, they were stuck. They couldn't get out, right? But what Jesus is talking about, he says, flee Judea, right? That's the fields and countryside around Jerusalem, the whole nation, that whole lower part, And so the warning there is, hey, if you're in Bethlehem or you're over in Hebron and you see Jerusalem surrounded by Rome's armies and they're under siege, he said, leave. Because we know later that Rome went through the whole area and wiped out a lot of them. And Jesus is saying, listen, Jerusalem's going to fall. They're going to lose. You don't want to be anywhere near this because there's going to be a lot of bloodshed. There's going to be a lot of people dying. It's not going to be just Jerusalem. Anybody, they've run into any Jewish people down there, they're going to kill you. So if you're in the countryside, you're over in Bethlehem, or you're in Hebron, or you're in any of these smaller cities of Jerusalem, Achish, any of that, leave. Just get out of there. You don't want to be around in Judea when Rome's army is there and they're mad and they're looking for people to kill. And that's all that he's saying here. Is it's a warning to everybody else in Judea that, hey, Jerusalem doesn't win. They're going to lose. So when you see Rome's army show up, leave. It's not going to turn out good for the Jewish people here. Just leave, right? And save yourself, right? So let's go, let's see how much time we got. Let's go just real quick to Matthew 24, verse 23. And, and in verse 22, he says those days are shortened, and so Jerusalem, in theory, should have had enough supplies to last a decade or more. They had their own water supply, they had food reserves. Those people should have been able to last like a decade. Now, it would have been strained because there was millions of people there, more than what the city normally would have had. But we know that there were all kinds of false Christs and false messiahs, and even within the city of Jerusalem, right before it falls, Josephus tells that whole story, that there was different people claiming to be the Messiah popping up within the city, claiming, hey, we got this, just follow me, and I'll lead you to victory against Rome. This is what we've been waiting for. And so, but then it kind of came up with this thing of like, hey, that group over there says that guy's the Messiah, but our guy's the Messiah. And so what they did was they went over and destroyed the food of the opposing groups, so those people would die out, because we can't have a false Messiah over there. We got to get rid of him. So they destroyed their food to get rid of all of those followers, because our guy is the real one. Right? And they destroyed each other. And they destroyed each other's food supplies. So they ran out of food in a couple of months. Right? And so they were starving, within a few years, within 3 years, this thing's in a mess. And so a siege like that should have lasted a decade or more. But they fell relatively quickly. Right? And that's what Jesus means. It was shortened. This could have been much more prolonged and horrible, but in terms of sieges for a major city, they fell quickly, right? And a lot of it was the infighting. All right. You know what? I'm going to stop this video there, because this next section or so, before we close this one, let me just point out something. Let's go back to Luke and Mark. So Mark, you can come to Mark first. So let's go to Mark 13. I just want to make one point real quick before we close. And so let's go to Mark 13, verse 1. I want to show you something, because clearly we just read Mark 13 and Luke 21, that they're dealing with the same general teaching that Matthew 24 is. All three of these Gospels have that. Matthew 24 has 3 questions. What will be the sign that these things are going to happen, the fall of Jerusalem? What is the sign of your coming? We'll deal with that one probably in the next video. And then what is the end of the age? All right, so 3 questions. And so his section is much longer. It includes some parts that Mark and Luke do not, because they don't have 3 questions. So let's go back and look at theirs. 13:1 in Mark. And then as he went out of the temple, one of his disciples said to him, Teacher, see what manner of stones and what buildings are here. And Jesus answered and said to them, Do you see these great buildings? Not one stone shall be left upon another that shall not be thrown down. Same opening, talking about the destruction of Jerusalem. Now look at verse 3. Now he sat on the Mount of Olives opposite the temple. Peter, James, John, and Andrew asked him privately, Tell us, when will these things be? And what will be the sign when these things are fulfilled? So the only thing that they're asking is about the destruction of Jerusalem. They don't ask about the coming of the Lord. They don't ask about the end of the age in this record. He's not recording that question, and he's not answering that question. So it's interesting to me that Mark only records the one question about the fall of Jerusalem. And then also go and look at Luke 21 real quick. So, if you look in verse 5 and 6, that's the question about, Jesus makes a statement about the stones being thrown down. Verse 7, this is their question. Teacher, when will these things be? And what sign will there be when these things are about to take place? So they're not asking about his coming. They're not asking about the end of the age. In Mark and Luke, both of these records are only dealing with that first question about what is going to be the sign of these things. And the only these things that's mentioned at any point leading up to that is that there won't be one stone left upon another in Jerusalem, right? So the reason that's important is because they don't have some of the pieces later that Matthew has. And so it makes it real clear, because sometimes, and put it this way, sometimes when you read Matthew, some people, I think because they misunderstand what the question of the coming of the Messiah, what will be the sign of your coming, they push that down the road to the future as if they're talking about Jesus' second coming. And so then they want to take all of that part and talk about, well, that's still in the future. But if you go to Mark and Luke, they don't ask him anything about his coming. They only ask him about the fall of Jerusalem. And they have the same answers that we just went through with Matthew, right? And so it makes it real clear, hopefully, that what Matthew has been dealing with up to this point is word for word in many places what Mark and Luke are dealing with, and they're only answering one question, and it's about the fall of Jerusalem, which fits with our analysis so far of Matthew 24, which is only dealing with one issue, and that's the fall of Jerusalem. As we move forward, we're going to get into a couple other pieces. But the main thing was, in Mark and Luke, they're only asking about the fall of Jerusalem. And so it makes it much clearer what Jesus is even talking about. But for whatever reason, Matthew seems to be the one that everybody draws from to talk about the future. But if you were to read it just in Mark and Luke, there's nothing in there about the future. There's nothing in there about a second coming. There's nothing in there that should have, it's super simple in Mark and Luke, that the only thing that's up for discussion at all is when Jesus says there's not one stone left on another. Well, that's the same discussion as Matthew 24. And so if Mark and Luke make it real clear this is just about the fall of Jerusalem, then hopefully you're beginning to see, and maybe you already have, that Matthew 24, that's what that's about too. All right, so we'll pause here. Our next video will pick up, and I think we're going to be getting close to dealing with that real tricky one of tell us about the sign of your coming. And so we'll do a whole video about that one.